following podcast is for informational purposes only. The contents of this podcast do not constitute tax, legal, or investment advice. Take responsibility for your own decisions, consult with the proper professionals, and do your own research.
I think it took me like 10 to 20 minutes to be like in love with the original theme, with the idea of the graph.
GRTiQ podcast.
We're like astronauts floating in the space of time, lost between the past and future.
Welcome to the GRTiQ podcast. Today I'm speaking with Esteban Ordano, co-founder of Decentraland, the world's first ever virtual world owned by its users. As most listeners will also recognize, Decentraland has been a user of the graph since the very early days. During our interview, Esteban shares a very fun perspective on a lot of great topics, such as the origins of Decentraland, why he moved from working at Google in Web 2 to becoming a builder in Web 3, the importance of decentralization, and why it often seems Argentina is one of the Web 3 capitals of the world. As always, we began the conversation by talking about Esteban's background.
I come from a small town inside of Argentina, and in high school I did one extra year, graduated as a chemistry technician, which is actually kind of like a minor in chemistry or something like that. Afterwards, I moved to Buenos Aires, where I studied software engineering at Instituto Tecnológico de Buenos Aires, Buenos Aires Institute of Technology, and did a couple of internships in India at a company called Infosys, in the States at Google a couple of times, but decided that the corporate environment wasn't quite for me. So I started a startup, didn't work out for me. And then I moved on to work as a software consultant in the blockchain industry, which at the time was nearly non-existent. But then things started to pick up, and then I went full life on Decentraland.
Well, I'm interested in this move from chemistry technician into software and technology. What was that path like for you to make that move?
I've always been very curious about computers and programming, but in the high school I went to, I only had three choices, and chemistry has always been super interesting to me, physics and all the natural sciences. I wanted to continue studying economics. I guess that eventually with getting into crypto, I satisfied that curiosity. But by my last year, I got a scholarship at this university, so I went for it.
And I know that Argentina has a very well-placed and engaged Web3 community there. What can you share with listeners about the attitudes and opinions of the people of Argentina towards Web3 and crypto?
I think in general, the population of Argentina is a few years ahead of the rest of the world in understanding inflation and understanding economic measures and why are they taken and how does it affect their day-to-day lives. And when my parents were expecting me, there was a period of hyperinflation in Argentina. And they always told me that the moment they got their wages, they spent it on diapers because it was a good way to save. And when I was 12 years old, approximately, we had a huge devaluation in Argentina. And all of a sudden, your money was worth a third of what it used to be. So all those sudden impacts on the economy alter your way of life in a very deep way. So that's why we get a lot of cumulative knowledge and a lot of understanding of the effects, both in the macro level, because you somewhat understand why those decisions are being taken. Usually they don't benefit you if you're a normal person. So that was my relationship with huge economic measures being so pervasive in your day-to-day life. And that's for most of Argentinians the same case. When crypto came along, we understood this a lot in a more natural way, because we're always thinking, oh, what if this happens and the government takes this decision because it will be like the best for the country or whatever, but my position may not be the best in that scenario, so I better hedge my bets in this way or this other. And that combines very well with the beginnings of crypto economic thought, and in general with this adversarial thinking about, well, this can blow up any moment, or like, is this really safe? And really going into the details and understanding what's good for you, what's good for your society, what's good for your environment, what's good for everyone else.
If we could go back in time for you personally, when did you first become aware of crypto, and what were some of your original impressions?
I remember reading about it on Hacker News a couple of times. I think that the time it really caught my eye was when maybe there was a flashy headline saying something like one Bitcoin is now $1. That's why I started to read the white paper, and it was very interesting. I thought that it could work, but I never thought that it was going to become popular. I thought, I had always thought that it was going to be a niche thing, but then somebody else started to mention it, how it was starting to being picked up for I think it was the WikiLeaks campaign or something like that, and I thought, okay, this could actually work, and this could actually get adoption by a mainstream audience, not just technical minds or technical people. So I doubled down on it and found a bunch of friends from college that were also into it, and we started to explore it on a deeper level and to work with it.
Well, prior to working with it and getting full-time into the space, you, as you mentioned, worked at places like Infosys and Google, which are very well-recognized names. What was the experience like for you working and being a builder at those two companies, kind of typical Web 2 companies, and how it's different from what you're doing now in Web 3?
Well, for me, it was a learning experience, and it was only an internship. But both in Infosys and at Google, I guess that you get the sense of how it will be to be a full-time employee there. I was very curious about Infosys, about how is it to live in India. This internship was in Bengaluru, and I really wanted to get to know India, and this was my opportunity to go there. The amount of bureaucracy, or how you get to game or like organize such a vast amount of people, and now I'm talking about both Google or Infosys, in order to align all the incentives and the will of so many people towards a greater good, has been really fascinating to see from the inside.
How do you think working at those two firms informed what you want to do with your career and this move you made into Web3?
So bureaucracy is one way to scale systems, right? And I thought that another way to scale societal interests towards some common objective would be automated execution of certain code. But the problem is that you cannot trust code in general because, like, for example, I'm a huge detractor of electronic vote. I think that electronic vote takes away the democratic element of votation. Suddenly you go from millions of people around your country from being able to audit how many votes were cast because anyone can read or like do basic arithmetic. Well, most of the people in the country can. When you switch that over to an electronic voting system, all of a sudden only a few people in your country can actually audit. Those few people that have the knowledge to go through the source code, to go through the build process of the hardware, and not even those who have the knowledge can audit the system because you have to be very careful about the chain of custody of every machine because anyone could insert a USB drive and hack the system or change it for something else. And besides, you have some accessibility issues and so on and so forth. But anyways, I think that my point is that in general, computer systems are not transparent. You cannot really know what is happening inside of the software systems that you're using every day. Most of the times, it always works. That's the thing. But the problem is the failure modes. What happens when it doesn't work? Or like what happens when you get hacked or things like that. So blockchains for me are a way to have transparent computing in the sense that your computer, my computer, and every computer kind of like says the same version of the blockchain, the same version of the information because it's self-verifiable information. A blockchain, for example, in Bitcoin, it's got this amount of hashing power, and that hashing power is kind of like a signature for the block, what gives it its validity. So that was for me really interesting about blockchain technology, how it can bring transparency into information systems, which is something that you don't get in general with not even a database or the software that you're currently using. You hope for the best in most cases, but you cannot really verify like at the level of the CPU, at the level of the memory, what is going on. Maybe if you're Magneto from the X-Men, you can see the atoms or whatever, but you will have to be really, really fast.
And that transparency and validation is important in the world. Why? There might be listeners that say, well, Web 2 is good enough. How would you explain that to them?
For example, going back to the voting system, like or democracy depends on that, on the transparency of that electoral mechanism. So if we are trusting the democracy of the country to a system, that system should be as transparent as possible. It could be a computational system. It could be a traditional paper and pen based system, but you want to ensure that your mechanism to decide in between all the members of society is as transparent as possible to prevent it from skewing towards one side or another. So I think that for these mechanisms of consent or coordination, it's very useful for for it to be transparent because it provides more legitimacy to the system.
Well, I know another thing that's important to you is this idea of malleable software. It was an idea that you shared before we started recording. How does that fit into all of this?
So Malleable Systems is a collective that is focused on having software being more useful to the user by ways of making it easily modifiable. So they have this analogy that software was becoming more and more malleable until we peaked at Excel in the mid-1990s. From then on, all software started to become more rigid and less changeable. Like before then, you had most of the users knowledgeable on Unix systems, knowledgeable on source code, but then you get all this massive inbound interest from mainstream audience, and they didn't know how to code. But most of the utility that we got out of computational systems came from automating finance for SMBs, small businesses, and Excel or spreadsheets in general have this quality that when I share a file with you, I'm not only sharing the data, but I'm also sharing the logic of how I'm thinking about that data. And I can change that logic. I can add a column, make some extra modification to this program that is the spreadsheet. And that has a lot of value. Imagine that if you could change the way your WhatsApp works or change the way the algorithm works on Twitter or Facebook or whatever social network you use. Most of the incentives in Web 2.0 are not aligned towards having you own the interface. In fact, they are aligned against that. They are aligned towards being able to show you more ads. They're aligned towards extracting as much information from how you use the software, which in turn also helps them to improve the way it works so that they can provide you with better software. So it's not inherently bad that it's currently this way. Like incentives have made it to be this way, but I think that it's a local maximum and we can do a much better job out of using computational system, out of using information systems and social networks based on computers that provide us a lot more value in general as a society. So yeah, Malleable System is kind of like that. They have a bunch of principles. Mostly your data should always be on your device, and software should be as easy to change as possible. And the changes that you make, it reminds me a lot to the free software movement of Stallman in the MIT in the early 1980s. How the user should own whatever software is executing on their computer, should be aware of what is happening, how is the data being shuffled, and always have the optionality to change how those information flows exist and are done and how are they useful to you.
The GRTiQ podcast is made possible by a generous grant from the Graph Foundation. The Graph Grants program provides support for protocol infrastructure, tooling, gaps, subgraphs, and community building efforts. Learn more at thegraph.foundation. That's thegraph.foundation.
Hi, this is GRTiQ. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Every download is a vote of support and helps drive the podcast forward. I want to especially thank those of you who've taken the time to leave a review, give a 5-star rating, or share your favorite episode on social media. Each week, the GRTiQ podcast shines a light on the people working to build Web3 in the graph, with the hope that hearing their stories and perspectives will help you as you make your own journey. If you have the ambition to make a contribution to the graph or Web3, then you should take the next steps and get involved. You can join the graph community on Discord, Reddit, the forum, and on Telegram. You can also explore becoming a graph advocate, joining the Graph Advocates DAO, or the new Subgraph DAO. You can find links to these opportunities in the show notes. Thanks for listening. Esteban, one of the things that I was most interested in asking you was this journey you've personally made from a small town in Argentina into big companies like Google, and then all the way into this entrepreneurship in Web3. Why did you decide to leave working for large firms and maybe some of the security and opportunities that presented and become an entrepreneur?
Well, it also kind of, I think that it happened. I have always been working on new things, even within these organizations or when working with private companies. I've always been skewed towards green grass projects or like new initiatives and things like that. And I guess it's a very personal thing for anybody. I didn't come up with Decentraland, not with the idea or the name. I was shocked that I was the first follower of the idea, and I think it's just something that kind of happens to you if you have a really good idea or if you really want to see a change in the world. It's sometimes both your environment and yourself that get to benefit from it.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Decentraland. So if you can go back in time and just share with listeners the origins of Decentraland, when the idea was born and what some of the original thinking was to launch it.
Yeah, so in the beginning, I remember a friend from college, Manuel Arauz, came to me and he was super excited about this idea. It was a lot fussier in the beginning. Like nowadays, I don't even remember if we wanted to do a simulation or like just a very transparent Second Life using just the blockchain in a very decentralized way. I think it was this idea that you could pick volumes of space and own them, and then everybody will see what you decided to put in the spaces that you owned. And we started to evolve that idea into the grid, created a couple of proof of concepts, and then it sat there for a while until Yemel, another one of the founders, got a VR headset, coded the first 3D interface to Decentraland. Up until then, it was just a 2D interface. And a couple of months earlier, we had gone to Burning Man, and we kind of like started to see how Decentraland could be like a virtual version of Burning Man, if that's possible. and later on, we started to figure out that this could actually work, and decided to go full life on it.
So are you saying part of the origin story of Decentraland is an experience some of the founders had at Burning Man?
I think the idea of going into this completely different world, to have a reset of who you are, or like what are the social accepted norms, to go from something completely different from your day-to-day life has a lot of value in exploring yourself and exploring your friends and the community that you go with towards these experiences. For me, one thing that I always tell is that by the third day or fourth day in Burning Man, I had to go buy ice, which is the only thing that you can trade for money in Electric City. And I had forgotten where I left my money or whatever. And when I looked at those rectangles with colors and faces on them, I was like, whoa, I remember this concept of of money, and it was a very strange moment. I had not thought it was possible to completely erase a preconception so big as money from your day-to-day life, and that changed things a lot for me. And going into I think it's one of the best art expositions in the world. It's like a gallery of things that change your perception, change the way you're seeing life, and yeah, it's a lot of fun. So
I've heard a lot of interesting stories come out of Burning Man, and some people, it is a real change for them. Like you said, it changes their paradigm. There might be some listeners that don't even know what we're talking about. What is Burning Man, and what was its impact on you personally outside of Decentraland?
for me, Burning Man is like an experiment on resetting certain ways from your day-to-day life, resetting some norms of your society. It didn't start that way, but right now it's very well established that there are these 10 principles, which is mostly like some guideline towards how to enjoy best the experience and to make the experience best enjoyed for everybody. And it's very basic, like leave no trace, or like be always accepting people. And it's the aesthetics are really like I identify very much with the aesthetics of it. It's kind of like a Mad Max thing. It's I'm not well versed enough in English to explain it. I will recommend anybody to like try to look at some YouTube video or something, but that's probably going to explain the aesthetics a lot better, and to read through the principles, because it's a very interesting social experiment. And I was very fortunate to go there, and it really did make me think about a lot of things in my life in a different way.
Let's go back a little bit to Decentraland for a moment. And for listeners that don't know what it is or how it works, how would you describe what it is?
Decentraland is a virtual world, we say, owned by its users. I will say that it's the first completely decentralized virtual 3D experience that doesn't require a single company to continue existing for the world to continue to exist. So basically, all the code is open source, all the important database entries are on the Ethereum blockchain or on Polygon, and most of the servers are run by the community, run by anybody who wants to run and contribute a node. So it's a lot of things. I always joke that I'm kind of Decentraland is kind of like a buzzword project. It's got NFTs, it's got a DAO, it's got a blockchain, it's got Web3, metaverse. We're missing AI, I guess, and AR. but when you start to dig into it, you start to realize, oh, well, it's one of the most active DAOs out there, and the kinds of questions that are being discussed in the DAO are very interesting, because it's very relatable, right? Like anybody can. It's not like a DeFi protocol where you are trying to adjust the interest rate of swaps. It's whether we should like have date and light in this virtual world, and there are a lot of meta governance questions as well, like how many voting power should a wearable NFT have compared to a land NFT? And those are, I think, are the trickiest and the most important questions, and the hardest to get right. But with regards to NFTs, we were cited in ERC 721 as like one of the first NFT projects. I think that we were the first ERC 721 project that was like fully compliant with the standard, because it was one of the first upgradable contracts. I'm only aware of MakerDAO being bold enough to try that before OpenZeppelin standardized that. So NFTs, DAO, metaverse. I don't really like that word, but I guess that people say that we are a metaverse. And it's decentralized because I think that's the future of computation. That's the future of social networks. I think that the risks of putting all the data all together into some organizations' servers, like it's a liability for them. I think they are trying to, like most of the people everywhere in the world, this is a maxim of mine. Most of the people are trying to do their best. And I think that the way data is being handled in most of these big corporations is the best that they can do, actually, in order to stay alive and in order to provide as much value for everybody. But it is still a risk. Like, I think that we can do the same, we can add the same value to our society with a different distribution of information and of data in a way that is safer for everybody and in a way that prevents certain abuses of that data.
So you mentioned you don't particularly like the word metaverse. And of course, it's getting a lot of headline attention because companies like Facebook, companies like Disney are creating metaverse-like experiences. Why don't you like that term? And how would you contrast what you're doing at Decentraland with how people understand what metaverse even is?
I like the idea of a metaverse being the next stage of the internet. I like the idea of it being like some 3D reincarnation of the web. I guess that's also why it gets usually aligned with the Web3 keyword or like buzzword. Both Web3 and metaverse are lousy definitions that generate a lot of expectation or like a lot of good future positive thought in persons. And I think that out of itself it's valuable. I can definitely see how Meta is getting into it or like Disney is getting into it. I think it's awesome to have a breath of originality, to have a good positive outlook towards the future and towards the future of the internet. And that's the part that I like about Metaverse and about Web3. The parts that I don't really like are the Black Mirror-esque aspects of the Metaverse. And regards Web3, I really don't like how privacy or selective disclosure is somewhat out of the picture. Like people talk about zero knowledge proofs and about like encryption or whatever, but in general, I think that we should start to build this new stage of the internet from the first principles of information wants to be libre. Information wants to be free. Like once I tell you something, it's going to be really hard for you to forget about it consciously or unconsciously. That information has entered your brain or whatever. And that is also true with regards to neural networks or AI or the recommendation mechanisms of these systems. Like, even if I ask you to delete my records from your database, maybe my patterns of behaviors have stayed on there, and there are information leaks that will never be like completely deleted. But anyways, I think that we as a society don't really understand all the implications of the information super highway, or so, I guess that's how they called the internet in the 90s. But my grandmother was like 19 or 20 years old when Claude Shannon came up with the theory of information paper, where he described what a bit is, what's the formula for the entropy of information. And that was way too late in the history of humankind. It's only a couple of generations ago that it happened. And nowadays, every 5-year-old knows how many megabytes do they have to uninstall in order to download the new game that just came out or whatever. And our understanding of the accumulation of so many megabytes it hasn't been built on a transgenerational level. And we have things like the right to be forgotten, and we have things like the expectation that I can ask you to delete my records from your database. And I think that's they are okay as social expectations, but I don't think that we understand how unnatural it is. It's kind of like saying, like, okay, from New York to Washington, gravity will not exist. And then you see all these people walking around as if gravity was there anyways. And you're like, oh yeah, I'm following the gravity rules, even though it's not required, but I do it anyways, or something like that. I don't think it's a good analogy. Like it's backwards in some way. But my point is that the natural laws of information go directly against certain uses and certain habits that we have as a society. And it's going to take a while to figure out better social agreements that are closer to the natural laws of information.
You mentioned Black Mirror risks. I'm not sure I'm familiar with what is meant by that. What is that?
Black Mirror is a TV show originated in the UK. It's a TV show about a science fiction TV show, miniseries. In each episode, they pick a subject and they go really deep into it. I think one of my favorite ones is the 3rd episode in the 1st season. You shouldn't binge watch it. Like, one a night is more than enough to take away your sleep. And one of these, I think it was in the later seasons, they explore the idea of living in a completely virtual world. And they go really deep into things like, what happens if we have a social scoring system? And they show this story of a woman that starts with a really high social scoring system that would allow her to do everything or whatever, and then her score starts to drop, and all of a sudden she sees all the backside of the system that was maintaining her privileged way of life. And I think it's a scary how much of that is already happens today, has already been happening for a couple of decades. It's just that right now in that TV show, they make an app out of that, and it's very graphic and a very well narrated story. Hi, this is Esteban Ordano with Decentraland. If my conversation with the GRTiQ podcast has been helpful to you, then please consider supporting future episodes by becoming a subscriber. Visit grtiq.com/podcast for more information. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
GRTiQ podcast.
Thanks for listening.
Roger that.
Let's go back to Decentraland a little bit here and the graph. So, Decentraland was one of the first projects for me as I got involved in the graph ecosystem that I became aware of as a user of the graph and subgraphs. And so, how would you tell that early history about that relationship between Decentraland and the graph?
I think it took me like 10 to 20 minutes to be like in love with the original theme, with the idea of the graph. I always had the concept of how you need some indexing solution, how you need to get all the information from the blockchain and rearrange it in a way that allows you to have better user experiences. At Decentraland, we had our own indexer, like custom code. We had many headaches because of that custom system. And when I heard about the graph and how they were not only solving it for one team, but for everybody, I thought that was going to be amazing. And it's really like more than meeting the expectations that I had, even with all the decentralization ethos that we always had on Decentraland. So we were one of the first adopters of the graph. And it was really awesome to see it come to life.
How would you describe specifically for listeners how Decentraland uses the graph?
So Decentraland uses the graph to make our user experience faster, same as with so many other Web3 decentralized applications. Usually the way that information is stored on the blockchain is not the optimal way in which you can query it. So the graph is useful for fetching who the owner of every land parcel is. We're also using the graph to verify that you own the wearables that your avatar is wearing. So all the wearables in Decentraland are NFTs. They are based on Polygon. And we also use the graph to make the marketplace experience a lot faster. We coded our own marketplace. That's because we launched it almost at the same time as OpenSea. And in that marketplace, we were running our own indexer. We were coding our own indexer. And we've always wanted to not run that server and to have that be a decentralized service that any user could run. So the graph is essential for many pieces of Decentraland for it to work correctly.
For listeners that may not understand, how important is the graph as a solution for builders like you, people with a vision for a project or a dApp they want to create, and they have an infrastructural solution like the graph to use?
The graph is so important to Decentraland that I think it will be harder to recover from the graph like suddenly disappearing, which when we get to the full decentralization stage, we are going to be safe from that. I think that the Decentraland Foundation can like cease to exist right now, and the Decentraland will continue to work. But some of the servers that are being run by Edge and Node and Edge, are a bigger centralization point of failure than the Decentraland team itself. So it's super critical and super important for Decentraland. I'm really looking forward for the decentralization of that. But it's so great that the graph source code is open, that anyone can run a node. We're looking into having every catalyst. That's the name that we have for the Decentraland content servers. Like anyone who runs a catalyst we're exploring the idea of they also running a graph node, so that we start to decentralize and improve the resilience of the system.
What's your long-term vision for Decentraland? What do you hope that it accomplishes in the world?
The mission of Decentraland is to find new economically sustainable ways to power the social networks and the information systems of the future. I think we are almost at the peak of the advertising revenue model and how it provided us with a lot of value. And I think that we can do a lot better than placing ads on everything. I think that similarly to the graph, the solutions got an element of micropayments, and the solutions got an element of curation of the best solutions. You can make some parallels between how the Substack model is gaining a lot of traction. You can make parallels with how many newspapers have started to switch from paywalls and advertising towards the subscriber model. And I guess that's the system of interrelations and how we as a society get our news or get our information, shifting towards a somewhat healthy, but that's my moral conviction, that advertisement as the blood that makes your product work is probably not enough.
For listeners that want to participate in Decentraland and get started in building, what's the best path to do so?
First, try it out. Like, we have a browser version, we've got a desktop version for Windows. A Mac version is in beta. If you go to our GitHub, you can probably find where the binary for Mac is. And our documentation is out there, and maybe join our Discord or forums and start to get together and meet new people, which is why we started all of this.
Esteban, I think the last question I want to ask you is pointing back to something you just said about the importance of decentralization. As you know, some people view the Web3 stack as being required to be fully decentralized, and there's others that back off that argument a little bit and say some of it will be decentralized, some of it won't. Where do you come in on that debate?
I think it's really important that users or organizations have the optionality of running the servers themselves. Whenever you have an information flow that has to happen outside of hardware that you control, you are giving away a counterpoint or a choke point or like a critical part of the processing of that information to some other party that may not be there tomorrow. So we've seen this with a lot of games that that were on the cloud and now you cannot play. We've seen that with, I don't know, like Google Reader for RSS, or like all the different softwares that have been on the cloud in the past. The fact that you are renting for it to work, it is necessarily inferior to having the ability to run it yourself, to having control over why it works and how it works, and the optionality of potentially running it yourself. It's already a huge game changer. Like, it's not like you can run your own Amazon Web Services in your house, but you can run the graph indexer in your house. Not that you do necessarily, but the optionality of having that control is very empowering for the user. It allows you to, even if this company that is providing you the service shuts down or goes bankrupt, you know that your business is not going to be endangered because nobody's going to be able to run that software anymore because it's closed software. Even worse than being closed software, it's behind the firewalls of the company that provides you with that server. So I don't necessarily tie this to Web3, but I think it's a critical piece for everything blockchain related, for everything that is that is about the security of your information, that is about the availability of the system. I think the data locality and software locality is one of the key ingredients of the software of the future. And Web3, if it's not runnable in your computer, then somebody's got power over you that, well, we might as well go back to Web 2.0 because everything works super fine anyways.
Well, Esteban, I really appreciate you taking time to answer these questions. We've now reached a part in the podcast where I'm going to ask you the GRTiQ 10. These are 10 questions I ask each guest of the podcast every week to help listeners learn something new, try something different, or achieve more. So are you ready for the GRTiQ 10?
Yes, I'm ready.
The GRTiQ 10.
This is the way.
10 questions for astronauts floating in space.
Roger that. This is the way.
What book or articles had the most impact on your life?
You started with a huge one. One single article or book. I think it would be the Tao Te Ching. There are many different translations. I like one more than the others. A woman called Ursula. But there are a lot of great books that I will hate to not mention, like The Selfish Gene, The Sovereign Individual, Atlas Shrugged, Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth, many more. There are many books that I enjoyed, and I came back to them after a few years, and it's kind of like a relationship in some way.
Is there a movie or a TV show that you think everybody should be required to watch?
I wouldn't require or force anybody to watch one movie, but I really like the theme on Mr. Robot, although I think it's a TV show and it's a little slow for times. And the last time that I remember that the movie made me cry was when I was watching a movie called Cinema Paradiso. It was really touching.
If you could only listen to one music album for the rest of your life, which one do you choose?
There's an Argentinian rock virtuoso called Luis Alberto Spinetta. He was way ahead of its time, and the music that he played is mostly unknown at the global in the global scene, but probably because of the cultural isolation from the political scene of Argentina in the 1970s. He had a band called Invisible, and it was it's a masterpiece.
Esteban, what's the best advice someone's ever given to you?
Breathe. The breathing is the only act that happens involuntarily, but you can make it be as voluntary as you like. And so even when you think you have like no choice, you can always come back to your breath and retake voluntarism and retake the consciousness and the agency of doing things.
What's one thing you've learned in your life that you don't think most other people know yet?
I'm a fan of a concept that the world needs more generalists and less specialists. I think that just knowing 3 or 4 principles from most disciplines gets you so much further ahead, and you can mix and match things from different disciplines, and that holistic understanding has a lot of compounding effects.
What about life hacks? Is there a life hack you've discovered for yourself?
Life is too short to spend it surrounded with people you don't like, and I am super surprised about how many people don't apply that to their work lives.
Based on your own life experiences and observations, what's one habit or characteristic that you think best explains people finding success in life?
Showing up. I think it was Woody Allen said, he he's not in favor. Like I think he would cancel or something, but that doesn't inverse ad hominem. That doesn't make this less true. Showing up is 80% of success, and you should always leave some slack, room for randomness in your day-to-day life for things to happen, and just show up and go the extra mile to do so.
And the last three questions, Esteban, are complete the sentence type questions. So the first one is, the thing that most excites me about Web3 is?
The thing that most excites me about Web3 is that it inspires people to reclaim computability over their own data, to make computer systems and social networks more humane and more social, less so mediated by corporations.
And how about this one? Complete the sentence. If you're on Twitter, then you should be following...
Udi Wertheimer. I think that's the funniest account that I'm following. But Balashis, Vitalik, Santi Siri are great philosophers and visionaries.
And the final question, I'm happiest when...
I'm happiest when I ship software or products and things that are useful for people. The realization of all the patterns in which I thought this was going to be helpful for somebody and actually seeing that happen, it makes me so happy.
The GRTiQ 10.
After this, I show you how deep the rabbit hole.
Esteban Ordano, thank you so much for taking the time and being so generous in answering these questions and introducing more listeners to Decentraland and some of these important thoughts you shared here. If listeners want to follow you or the work you're doing at Decentraland, what's the best way to stay in touch?
Well, until we get better decentralized alternatives, I'm on Twitter at eordano or on Discord at the Decentraland Discord. You can find it on decentraland.org.
This has been a production of the GRTiQ podcast. For more information, including detailed show notes, visit grtiq.com/podcast. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
Please consider contributing to this project and helping build the community by subscribing and leaving a review. GRTiQ Podcast. Roger that.